Hello everyone, Michael here for Tactica Imperialis. Welcome to today's video. Today it's going to be a Warhammer 40,000, or well, I should say 30,000 theory video. After my previous theory regarding the traitor Primarchs and the Emperor's actions regarding them, a lot of people were wondering about Angron and his homeworld Nuceria, particularly why the Emperor didn't actually decide to intervene in the battle between Angron's slave army, the Eaters of Cities, and the Nucerian military. This is a question that I've considered in the past as well, and with you guys asking for answers, I thought it'd be a good time to go digging through the lore and see what we can find out about Nuceria. After all, the Emperor must have stayed out of the battle for a reason other than because it fit the plot, and maybe we can shed some light on why today. If you have any thoughts on this, feel free to leave them in the comments below when we're done, along with any other theories from the 40k or 30k universe you would like me to take on in future. For now though, it's time to don our inquisitorial hat and start investigating. Let us begin. We'll start by cataloguing what we know of Nuceria from the time of the Great Crusade, to see if that gives us any evidence for the lack of intervention. Nuceria is located, let's have a look at this map, somewhere in the Ultima Segmentum, the region of space in the galactic east that contained Baal, Macragge, Kamos, Prospero, and Olympia, to name but a few planets. Problem is, the Ultima Segmentum is the largest of all regions in Imperial space, so while half the galaxy or more is knocked out by this piece of evidence, we can't really pinpoint it much further. This means we can't use the idea of Nuceria was part of some other empire or sector in the Imperium, with the most likely suggested candidate being Ultramar, as a reason for the Emperor not to assist the slaves in the revolt. In fact, it's implied later that Nuceria did not lie within the bounds of Ultramar, as Guilliman's attack on Lorgar for his actions in Ultramar during the Shadow Crusade, including Calf, came on Nuceria, but the 13th Primarch had to chase his brother down to do it, suggesting that Nuceria was not one of the worlds in Guilliman's empire. Beyond geography, Imperial records indicate that Nuceria was a civilized world, with highly advanced technologies, which is no surprise given that the butcher's nails used on Angron were not understood by the Imperium to any great extent at the time. It also had a thriving slave trade in one form or another, as Angron's initial uprising saw grievous casualties on the slaves' end, but they still had 2,000 survivors. If we assume first a 50%, then a 90% casualty rate, that means that there were between 4,000 and 20,000 gladiators on Nuceria at the time. Reportedly, every gladiator on the planet was gathered together for some big event when the uprising happened. And that says nothing of all the menial/labour-based slaves that must have come along with that. Nuceria seems to have been based, at least from what I could gather in the lore, on ancient Rome, with Angron being the equivalent to Spartacus, so that would mean a lot of slaves. It's now a dead world, so dead in fact the Imperium didn't even bother to hit it with exterminatus following the heresy. Angron did such a good job cleansing the place on his return that they didn't need to hit it with cyclonic torpedoes or whatever the exterminatus flavour of the month so happened to be. So, what have we learned so far? Well, we have a highly technological world somewhere in the galactic east with a presumably large slave trade. As far as answering the question though, we've learned basically nothing. The only scrap I think we can salvage is the technology. Perhaps the Emperor and the Mechanicum assumedly with him wish to preserve as much of the Nucerian tech as possible. Given that everyone in Angron's army was implanted with the Butcher's nails, this may have not been so easy had they chosen to side with the Red Angel. With the compliance of Nuceria supposedly almost complete by this point, it could have been common sense to deal with the Nucerians peacefully, as opposed to a violent solution that would compromise the population's view of the Imperium in the long run. But now we come to a new problem, that of resources. Angron was leading an army of about 1,000 gladiators at the time the Emperor arrived on Nuceria. The other 1,000 who had survived that initial breakout had either starved to death or been killed by that point. And the forces arrayed against them were massive. 7, count them, 7 full-stack Nucerian armies, likely well-trained and certainly well-armed. It is said by some in very rough calculations that a Primarch is equivalent to about 100 Space Marines, and thus, if an Astartes is worth about 100 regular humans, then Angron was worth about 10,000 of those people. But even then it looked pretty damn bleak for the Red Angel and his fellow slaves. This raises the question of how much time, resources, and energy the Emperor would have been forced to commit in order to balance things out and then give the Imperials a massive advantage, so as Angron and any other Imperials involved were put at minimum risk. Conserving numbers so far from Terra may have been something in the back of the Emperor's mind, we just don't know. Let's be honest, it would have required a pretty decent-sized force to defeat 7 armies at once, and those 1,000 gladiators basically counted for diddly squat. And unfortunately, mass firepower is just a thing that exists, so a tiny force of custodians would have likely drowned in bullets, even if they even the odds to an extent. I mean, you try making 500 2+ saves in a row, see how far it gets you. As a result, it would have probably been necessary for the Warhounds Legion, the original name for the World Eaters for those who don't know, to deploy in relatively large numbers in order to turn the tide. Not because of the power of each individual Nucerian, but simply because there have been too many shots coming at the Astartes for a small or medium-sized force to survive, or at least not have some kind of Pyrrhic victory. Sure, Angron would contribute a huge amount, but he had no good weapons, he had no good armour, and so he'd only been able to get so far. In terms of resources, therefore, pulling Angron out actually makes a lot of sense. It's the most efficient way to conserve resources. But what about going down the diplomatic route? The Emperor was said to have had incredible charisma, only amplified by his prodigious psychic abilities. He also likely had Malcador the Sigillite with him, along with an entire legion of Astartes and a custodian force presumably in space. So why, oh why, instead of teleporting Angron away, did he not attempt to stop the violence on Nuceria using diplomacy and negotiation? I mean, he had a winning hand. He was holding, what's the highest hand in poker? A royal flush against, one pair. So why not play it? I have a couple of reasons as to why. The first is that the Great Crusade didn't really use negotiations to bring worlds into compliance. This isn't the Tau. Compliance was accepted or forced by the Space Marines. There was no middle ground. It wasn't, well, if you do this, then maybe we'll do this. It was, no, you take it or you get wrecked. As a result, I would wager that negotiating wasn't even a considered option, even if it was a good one. Secondly, I doubt the Nucerian leaders would have budged in time to save Angron. By the time the Emperor had travelled to see each of the 7 armies' generals or their higher-ups and talked them round, then gone back to Angron and convinced the armies to stand down, or those leaders got the message around in some way, I get the feeling that the bloodshed would have already started, and so it would have been a complete waste of time. Plus, to the Nucerians, Angron and the gladiators were slaves. They were property. They'd no right to rebel, no right to be free, and they'd killed large numbers of people during and after their escape, which would only complicate any diplomatic efforts. So I think diplomacy and negotiation, whilst a valid and probably a really good option in principle, would have either failed or just not succeeded in time. At this point, I wish to postulate a theory put forward in the comments regarding the Emperor's decision by Dan Jackson. He suggested that Angron would have either refused or resented Imperial aid in the battle, believing it better that he and his army die with honour. This would make sense in a way. It was basically the reason Angron didn't go with the Emperor in the first place. He would have rather died fighting the oppressive rulers of Nuceria than abandon his friends to lead armies in his image. He was really close to the other gladiators. When he came back to Nuceria, he travelled to their gravesite to pay his respects. It was actually, I believe, a mass open grave, and he wore some of their skulls around his neck so that they could see and taste the blood of their oppressors, getting that revenge they so craved during the cleansing. The counter-argument to this, raised in the same thread by Adrian Merzowski and in other comments by some others, is that while Angron may not have liked it, he would have been thankful and possibly even respected the Emperor for keeping him and his companions alive. Perhaps fighting alongside his father would have shown Angron both that the Emperor was an honourable warrior and leader capable of helping Nuceria, and that the Imperium was willing to take the side of the little guy for the betterment of all. Plus, well, what better father-son bonding could you get than massacring thousands or millions of enemy soldiers side by side? Am I right? Right? Just me? Okay. I think, more than likely though, the idea of fighting never crossed the Emperor's mind. Nuceria was on the edge of compliance anyway, and it was far faster to just pull Angron out and face the consequences than try and overthrow the establishment he'd been working with, beating into the ground up until then. And that's it. I rest my case. I can come up with no further evidence concerning the Emperor's course of action on Nuceria. So, why did he choose to pull Angron out instead of help him in some way? The first reason will be resources. Fighting alongside Angron would have involved a reasonably large deployment of Astartes or Custodians to try and deal with the sheer number of Nucerians facing Angron down. The second will be time. The crusade was supposed to be fast moving, and it would have been a relatively long engagement to deal with Nuceria and then set up a new government, etc., especially with the nails enhanced Angron and co likely to be baying for blood as opposed to thinking practically. Plus, it's possible the Astartes may not have been ready to deploy in such large numbers in such a short time. The Eaters of Cities were massacred the morning after the Emperor came, the morning after the night before, in a way. So a full deployment may just not have been possible in a few short hours. I'm purely speculating there, but it is possible. A third factor, depending on how harshly you wish to look at the Emperor, is that the Lord of Mankind just assumed that Angron would be fine with it once he was with his legion. The Emperor maybe lacked the empathy or that human touch required to appraise the situation correctly. Bear in mind, this was probably a snap decision based on how little time passed between Angron's refusal and departure. So it's also possible the Emperor simply didn't have long enough to think the whole thing through and plan far enough ahead. So I believe there are two possible conclusions here that we can draw. If we look at it practically, the Emperor was conserving resources and choosing the most convenient/efficient option to keep the crusade going and set up another legion with their Primarch. If we look at it cynically, the Emperor just didn't understand Angron and what he had to do. He couldn't see the small picture as he was too fixed and focused on the overarching goal. I'll let you decide where you place yourself between those two answers, but I think it's a combination of the two. The Emperor was in charge of the entire Imperium and the Great Crusade at this point. Horus wasn't War Master yet. And so he had to think large scale and long term. Perhaps that's why he missed the detail and simply chose the most practical option at the time. We may never know, but that's what I think. Let me know your opinions in the comments below. That's all for today. I do hope you enjoyed the video. If there are any other theories you'd like me to take on, then do let me know and I'll consider them for the future. Possibly, if you wish to help you find them, include the word theory in your comments so I can filter them a little more effectively. Thank you all for watching. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Bye for now.